Welcome everybody to the 20 mark guide by me, Josh Leong, on the bottom as you can see. I'm just going to quickly run through how to do them. It's much requested. 1 month to exams. Gotta get that exam technique on lock. So yeah, let's just move. Some important information before getting onto the main part of the video. I will be offering some masterclasses near the end of April on topics. If you're interested, please email me on the email seen on screen right now and in the description. Masterclass will be similar to the globalization speedrun I did, in which I will just go through the whole spec and just tell you what you need to know for every single point, so the examiners can't trick you out on anything. And then we can go through some questions and how to tackle them at the end of his masterclasses. And this opportunity will be a first come first serve basis. So the quicker you email me, the quicker I can secure you a spot and give you the information. So yeah, if you're interested, email me and we can take steps forward from there. And again, before you watch my 12 marker video before you get onto this. I uploaded this 6 months ago now, which is quite a long time. And there are many overlapping themes in the assessment criteria, so definitely check that one out before. And demystifying 20 markers. I see a lot of people just absolutely pull their hair out when it comes to 20 markers. They're really not that bad. They're just 20 markers but extended. And an analogy I like to think about it is to just help people. Is like, just imagine 20 markers are 12 markers with some mild curry spice. The mild, I didn't even know, I just found this random image. As you can see, it's 1 chili out of 4 chilies. It's not even gonna it's not really that spicy. 20 markers aren't that bad. They literally just add a dash of curry spice at the end, and that's all you need to complete the 20 marker. So you just need to add a bit of spice at the end of a 12 marker to make a 20 marker. That is how you should be thinking about it. Alright, moving on. So what does evaluate actually mean? So the Google definition of evaluate is to form an idea of the amount, number, or value of, and semicolon assess. So notice, guys, how I mentioned how 20 markers are extended 12 markers. You literally just have to assess, but do a bit more at the end. And here's my definition. It's just to do more than an assess question. Imagine assessing, but you need to link a bit more. If that makes sense, it will make more sense later and have multiple views. So you need to argue both sides, which you will do in a 12 marker already, but then you need to question your arguments. That is the little bit at the end that separates a 12 marker from a 20 marker. So again, don't get too wrapped up in the definition. I feel like oftentimes when you look at these definitions, you get even more confused. Don't think about it too much. I'll show you later. And another key thing you need to remember before tackling these 20 markers is revisiting the idea of spatial versus temporal scales. So if you watch my 12 marker video, you know I was stressing about how this is like a hack and how to not get extra marks, but to gain all the marks. And you also need to use this idea in 20 markers as you need to assess as well. And the easiest way to assess, in my opinion, is to argue whether factors are influential on a spatial or temporal scale. So you argue whether factors are short-term, long-term, local, or on a local, national, or international scale. And using this criteria, you can easily argue things like long-term factors are more significant than short-term, or international factors have a more influential than local factors as they have a global reach. That is how you should be assessing, really. So moving on, here's the timings for a 20 marker. So ideally 1 mark a minute, so would be the best. But this is basically never possible, as exams probably not going to go your way most of the time, because you're going to be taken aback by some questions. So here is a tier list of the best total times to complete a 20 marker in. So ideally, you'll be doing it in 20 minutes in the best case scenario. A good time would be 20 to 25 minutes. If you just aim for that tier and you'll be good. A perhaps more dangerous time would be 25 to 29 minutes. You'll get to the point where you might be spending a bit too much, but if you spend 30 minutes on it and above, you just need to move on to the next question. There's no point dwelling on it too much. And these timings do include like a little 2-minute plan. And also, it should say 5 minutes per main body paragraph. But yeah, you should be spending around 5 minutes per big paragraph, roughly. And another key note you should do is always plan your 20 markers. So never go straight into a question. Spend at least 1 minute planning. So your plan shouldn't be in detail at all. You only need to note what your intro will include in a few words, note some key factors in your main body paragraphs, and choose how you will conclude. So if you see here, this is an image taken from my mocks last year. I literally wrote intro P1, P2, P3, and I wrote something very small. You can't really read it here, but your plan should include something like that. There's a lot of times where I've tried in the past, when I first started geography A levels, I tried to just go straight into the question, but you'd realize you come to a block halfway through, and that is the worst thing to happen in an exam. So just look at this example of a plan and look how bare it is. Literally 1 minute of thinking, and just need to think of the three factors very quickly that you're going to write about, and have what you need to know in mind. And a good exam hack I did in the actual exams was I noted down the time I started questions, and then I roughly noted when I should be finishing. So if you can see here, I wrote down it was 1:07 when I started this question, and I gave myself I can't see what that says, but I gave myself probably 20 minutes to do it in, and it just helps you keep a track of time. All right, so let's get actually to the main part of the video then. All right, so the structure is very simple, very similar to 12 markers. So unlike a 12 marker, the introduction is a must. You must have an introduction, and it needs to be quite large compared to a 12 marker one, which was optional. And then you have three main body paragraphs and a conclusion, which is also a must. And you might be thinking 12 markers only require three paragraphs as well. Well, as I said before, 20 marker paragraphs have an extra bit at the end that really differentiates it from 12 markers, and you'll realize it's actually not that bad. So yeah, let's move on. So let's start with the introduction and how to write it. So put simply, here's the steps. So number one, definitely define key terms and ideas at the start. And then introduce your arguments or your points or the factors or your views actually. And then a good thing you could do is to just make the examiner impressed, is to include any contextual random statistics related to the question at hand to show them, look, I've revised geography. I assure you, the examiners will probably be reading the same thing over and over again for every essay. So if you write something little, a random statistic, it'll really throw them off and be like, wow, this guy is really something. Because whilst everyone else is writing the same thing, you've written something slightly different. And four, make sure to introduce the argument, the spatial temporal argument, which is the ultimate hack for these large mark questions, as I've stressed before in the 12 mark video, and I will stress in this video as well. So the following example paragraphs are taken from our mocks in March 2023, which has been a year now, and they are based on the following question: evaluate the view that coastal flood risks are increasing mainly because of rising sea levels. And this example actually received 19 out of 20 according to my teachers, and I will actually discuss how I could improve it as well. So here's my example introduction. Pause it, have a read at it. I will probably write out the whole thing in the description, maybe. Actually, I won't do that, but we move. Just read it carefully and notice a lot of things. Take a pause, read it. All right, I'm going to move on now. So I'm just going to analyze what I did well here. So immediately, I defined key terms. Or I described key terms at least. I defined coastal flooding and when it occurs. And then on the second part, I introduced the key factors and used the idea of the spatial and temporal scale argument, which you will be spamming. I'm telling you now. How many times have I said it? And look, listen, at a glance, action rising sea levels, that's one factor, climate change and human activities. And then I also notice how I talk about long term and then short term. Straight away, you're slightly assessing. You're showing the examiner you're assessing. So by introducing this type of argument, you could maybe make it easier for yourself and make the examiner know what you're doing. And then here's the random fact thing I was telling you about. So I talked about the IPCC estimating 1 meter sea level rises by 2100. And yeah, this is very simple. So follow the steps here and you should be good. Yep, so again, just to reiterate what you have learned here, define key terms, introduce your key factors. In most of your cases, it'll be three factors, and talk about at what scale do they act. Are they long term, short term, international, national, local, blah blah, and have some little statistic at the end to add more context to the question. So yeah, let's move on to how you should format your main body paragraphs. So I probably overcomplicated this, but I use the 2-1 technique, which I've devised. So you should be having 3 main body paragraphs. They're 3 large chunky paragraphs. And for this 2-1 technique, imagine with answering evaluate the view that coastal flood risks are increasing, mainly because of rising sea levels. I always overloaded one side of a view. So for example, you could have 2 paragraphs that agree with a view and have 1 paragraph disagree with a view, or 2 paragraphs disagreeing with a view and 1 paragraph agreeing. So let me put this in more detail for you. So I preferred 3 chunky paragraphs as opposed to the standard 5 paragraph structure that is often promoted. So what this structure does is it ensures your essay leans towards a conclusion, which makes the wrap up at the end a lot easier. So an example of this for the same question that I'm gonna for this question, evaluate the view that large scale water management often creates more problems than they solve for people and the environment. What I would do is I'd write 2 paragraphs explaining why large scale projects create problems, and then 1 paragraph on how they actually solve problems. So in this way, the overall arching theme of your paragraphs or your essay will be that the large scale projects are creating more problems. So then your conclusion can easily agree with you. So you can lean the argument towards what you want to argue and make it easier for yourself. So in a sense, whilst you should have a balanced argument, you also want to just make life easier for yourself and lean towards a certain view. That is what the 2-1 method is all about. So the 2-1 method is mainly for 3 paragraphs, but if you want to do 5, for example, you could have 3 agreeing with a view and 2 disagreeing. But it's the same thing. Just always try to lean towards an argument so it's easier for yourself in the long run. Now, how to structure the main body paragraphs. Again, it's very simple. Use a PEE structure, point, evidence, explanation. Only difference is this hacks thing. I couldn't think of a name to name this apart, but this is what separates 20 markers from 12 markers is the hacks. So let's go through every point. So point, again, introduce your argument related to the question and say if your factor is significant in a long, short term, or is on a local or international scale. Again, spatial and temporal scale. That is what you should be using. And the language you should be using should be like, on one hand, this is the most significant, and yeah, it's very simple. And then for your evidence, it's just evidence really. Give place specific detail. For example, this is seen in blah blah blah. I'll show you later. And the explanation, the key things you need to be hitting is what does your evidence show? How does this back up your point? And can you? Another big thing that carries on from 12 markers is how you can introduce models. So, can you introduce the Kuznets curve in a sustainability question, for example? Yeah, that's what you should be doing. And tell the examiner the significance of your point, again, on a spatial or temporal scale. Assess. And then number 4, hacks, which is what I will show you later. All right, so now we move on to hacks, which is what really separates 20 markers from 12 markers. And this is how you ensure you're hitting those marks. So after assessing within your paragraph, you must do an extra step where you compare your point. You compare another factor within the paragraph and question the point you just made. So this could be it come in the form of things like, however, this argument is far too shallow as a multitude of factors contribute to this process. Factors like insert your own factor can play an equally important role in the long or short term. So this is just a little bit at the end, That's just showing that you're evaluating as you're considering alternative views and you're questioning your own point and you're comparing each factor in the process. And using this, you can introduce new factors more easily. So let's look at my example here. So let me just read it out. On one hand, the view holds well in the short term. So straight away, introduced my point and introduced the temporal scale argument by mentioning how it's short term. And then this is my simple one-line evidence. With the IPCC estimating sea level rise of 1 meter by 2100, it is safe to assume that over a short term, rise in sea levels are driving coastal flood risks. So here, the mistake a lot of people make is they just pile as much PSD evidence as much into, they try condense it into like 10 lines. So don't pile too much evidence. It's not worth much relative to assessing. So your evidence should be very simple, really, such as this. And I put another example in here, or evidence. For example, presently, areas in the Pacific Islands like Kiribati are sinking due to thermal expansion of oceans, which is raising sea levels and threatening the population by relocation. Here, I explain how sea levels rising occurs. And let's see, where's the 20 marker? So the 20 marker, evaluate the views that coastal flood risks are increasing mainly because of rising sea levels. I've explained the theory behind sea levels. I've explained how sea level rising occurs, and that's what explanation ticked off. But then you also need to assess and you need to add a bit more to end here. So this rising sea level is driving the government to buy land in Fiji and develop migration schemes with HICs to prepare for the relocation of citizens. Okay, here's another factor. I've talked about why it is a risk, or why sea level rising is a risk, because it causes people to relocate. And then I've talked about relocation migration schemes in Fiji, which is another evidence in a sense. And then here's the part that you really need to get used to. So this is significant, as it shows how in the short term, rising sea levels are threatening local citizens to leave their countries. Guys, this is very simple. Notice how I didn't overcomplicate anything. I just got straight to the point. I said this is why it is significant. This short assessment is also used in 12 markers, and this is what you also need to be using. Again, I'm using that short-term argument, which you should need to be spamming. And then, this is the part that separates. So listen carefully. This is the part that separates 12 markers from 20 markers. Literally, 3 lines separate it. However, this argument is far too shallow, as it can be argued that climate change is actually driving these short-term floods over the long term. So here, I question whether my point is valid, and I suggest the importance of other factors. This is this hacks part I'm talking to you about. You need to suggest why you question your argument. Is your argument stupid? Is your argument only valid in the long or short term? Or is it only valid when looking at things on a local scale? It is literally these 3 lines that basically separates the 20 marker from the 12 marker. You need to understand why your argument is correct, but at the same time, for when you're evaluating, you need to understand why question its validity. That is what you need to be doing. Again, guys, it's really not that bad. Look at me. I did 3 extra lines to hit that 20 marker. So it's nothing crazy. I'll show you another example here. So let me read it out for you again. On the other hand, notice the language I'm using. I'm comparing. It's this constant comparison you need to be doing to hit that 20 marks. The view can be considered impartial, as rising sea levels is an impact and comes under the much bigger factor in global warming and climate change. I, again, put a very simple point. Here, I could have used the idea of a spatial temporal scale argument. So here, as you can see, I mentioned that climate change is a longer term. I should have mentioned here, which is a mistake on my part, that this is climate change is a longer term factor. And then, here's my evidence. Since the world is in a post-glacial period, it can be argued that rising sea levels is a given and is only a short-term explanation for flood risks. Since the Industrial Revolution, global warming has driven thermal expansion and is causing glaciers to melt, which causes rising sea levels. Here, my slight evidence is the idea of a post-glacial period, and I also talked about the Industrial Revolution. This is paired with a slight explanation of how climate change causes sea levels to rise. So I used a bit of evidence to suggest and back up my point that climate change is the bigger factor and is the driving factor behind flood risks. And then let me read it out again. However, this is just one of many impacts climate change brings. Climate change has increased global frequency of tropical storm and has increased the intensity of such storms. For example, here's my more evidence. Countries like Bangladesh will suffer from more intense tropical storms. These intensified tropical storms will bring large storm surges with the high wave heights and high precipitation, which will further drive coastal flood risks. Again, guys, my evidence is very simple. I talk about countries at risk, and I'm not really using much PSD, which is could be improved on, but I feel like it gets the job done. You need to explain essentially your point and explain how I explained how climate change affects coastal flood risk directly. That is a simple explanation. But then to bring this back, to make sure you're hitting the marks, again, you need to suggest why it is significant and you need to assess. So here I said this is significant as it shows that climate change can drive numerous factors, including sea level rise, which means that climate change is more influential in driving flood risks than sea level rise. So here I've directly assessed and suggested which factors of mine are more important. And again, this is what you need to be doing. This is what separates 12 markers from 20 markers. We're making comparisons throughout. And let me read out the rest of it. So, moreover, climate change affects a wider range of players on a global scale and is a more long-term factor driving flood risks. What I said to you guys earlier about this constant comparison you need to be doing, you need to constantly question if your point is valid and if there is a bigger factor in play. And here I've done exactly just that. And that is what is hitting my marks. I'm comparing both of them. And yeah, essentially, the most important thing you need to know is after assessing in your 20 markers, you need to compare factors. And that is how you hit the marks. All right, so let's move on to the final paragraph of my example essay. Unfortunately, the way this was scanned, it meant that I couldn't write in the annotations like I did here. But I'm just going to freestyle it on top of my head. So, as you can see at the start, I talk about finally, human activities can be argued to be more influential than sea level rise, but does not compare with climate change. Look at what I've done, guys. This is what separates 20 markers from 12 markers. I've literally compared every factor throughout. I've compared every factor throughout and thoroughly. So here I talk about how human factors are more influential than sea level rise, but then when it comes to climate change, it does not compare well. I think, to improve on this, I could have talked about the spatial temporal scale again, talk about how does it compare well in the long term or short term. But just ignore that for now. I'll talk about it later. For example, in Bangladesh, the low GDP of $150 billion in 2018 has meant that the government has cleared mangroves for lucrative shrimp farming to boost economic growth. In the short term, this increased economic growth. Sorry, let me just take a step back there. I talked about here. I've given my evidence. GDP 150 billion, and then this has led to governments clearing mangroves to boost economic growth. That's my evidence. Sorted. Done. Again, guys, I've remembered two things here. It's low GDP in 2018. One fact, and then I've also mentioned that the government are clearing mangroves. A mistake I already mentioned a lot of people make is that they think, oh, let me put in like another key fact here, another key statistic. I'm gonna put in what Bangladesh's president did on Monday, or what Bangladesh's favorite food is as evidence. You don't need any of that. Just think carefully about what you're gonna put in. The evidence is very small. If you notice in all other two paragraphs I've showed you, my evidence is minimal and it gets the job done. And I don't go too crazy on it. Because once you go too crazy on it, you're just wasting time writing too much. And yeah, now looking back, my handwriting's quite neat in this. But that's just, yeah, okay. I'm waffling now. Let's move on. And again, evidence is very simple. Okay, simple evidence. That's the point I want to get across. Now, moving on, in the short term, the increased economic growth is influential as the government will have an increased income to invest in new defences like seawalls and offshore breakers. Yep. So I've explained it. I've explained how, in the short term, this is effective, which is a good way of assessing stuff. I'm literally assessing right here. I'm explaining why. First of all, I've explained why in the short term it's good. However, I'm gonna then go on to explain why it's bad in the long term. And notice here, whilst I'm explaining things, I'm also assessing at the same time. I've talked about its influence in the short term, which is good. This is what you need to be doing. All right, let's move on to the next part. So this is the same paragraph, but it's on a different page. However, over a longer term, guys, look what I'm using again. Long term, short term. I've literally said this a million times this video. Removal of mangroves can actually cause increased flood risk. This is because mangroves are very effective at breaking waves approaching the coast, and its roots bind sediment together to prevent erosion. Okay, here I've done the same thing, but I flipped it. I've talked about long term and why it's bad, and then I've also explained some theory behind mangroves. This is what you need to be doing, guys. You need to be questioning your point, which is why I'm hitting the marks here. I'm evaluating right here. I've talked about, okay, on a short term, it's good, but wait, long term, not so good. That is literally, I'm questioning my point right here. And then, this is the key part here. This shows that although there's a slight short term improvement on coastal flood defences with more income, eventually the long term threat of coastal floods means that the removal of mangroves will increase flood risk over the long term. So, what have I done here, guys? I've compared the benefits and risks. I've questioned whether my initial point of it being short term good is valid. And then this shows that okay, so with more eventually, this means that the removal of mangroves will increase flood risk over the long term. Guys, I can't stress how important this long term, short term argument is. I'm actually, please, guys, please use this. This is literally prime example of what you need to be doing. And then with evaluating, again, I'm questioning my point. I've literally questioned whether my argument is correct. And then by using this long term, short term argument, you can easily evaluate. And then this therefore shows that the sea levels rising operates on a shorter term scale than the removal of mangroves, and the removal of mangrove is also on a shorter term than climate change. This is the final part that kills it. I think this is probably the best paragraph out of the three, because I've questioned my point, which I've evaluated. I've hit the PE structure very simply at the start, and then at the end, I've compared it. I made a comparison to the other three factors. This is what you need to be doing, guys. So again, take a pause, read it, and then understand it fully before you move on. And then key points, make sure to assess the relative importance of factors within your paragraphs. This should be done throughout to ensure that evaluation is throughout your essay. Alright, so this key point, I've stressed it already. Assess relative importance of each factors and have that little bit at the end that's comparing. Alright, so here's the conclusion. Here is why I've suggested the 2-1 method, which I taught you earlier. If you've argued for the view in 2 paragraphs and 1 against, you will lean towards agreeing with you. And in my examples case, I have argued against the view twice. So I've suggested 2 more significant factors in sea level rise. So just to refresh your mind, the question was here, evaluate the view that coastal flood risks are increasing mainly because of rising sea levels. So paragraph 1, I suggested, yeah, sea level rising is definitely driving coastal flood risks. Paragraph 1, here, suggested sea level rise, yep, definitely the point. Paragraph 2 suggested climate change is the bigger factor. Paragraph 3 suggested human activities are another factor that's bigger than sea levels rising. So here's my 2-1 method. Here, I've literally argued against the view twice. So in the conclusion, I'll naturally go against the view posed in the question. So this is why I'm telling you guys to just sort of lean your arguments towards one section. So in the conclusion, when the examiner reads through and be like, oh, this guy's arguing against it, naturally the conclusion should be against the view. So the conclusion extended, it's very simple. Again, it's very similar to 12-marker conclusions, but 20-marker conclusions is much juicier and meaty in the sense that you need to write a bit more. And then obviously, because you've made more comparisons, you can say more. So the steps on how to do your conclusion are simple. Simple point line / line linking the question, agreeing with the view or disagreeing, calling the view impartial, partial, correct. And then step two is to reiterate your points briefly by talking about the most significant factor, including the scale they operate at. That is another very important thing. And then make sure you briefly compare the factors and say which one comes out on top. So let me just give you my example here. Guys, I haven't lied when I said I got 19 here. So I got 5 marks on A1, 14 marks on A2. So let me read it out to conclude. Oh, another thing is, if you are running out of time, guys, definitely still write the conclusion. And the conclusion, it can be very short, but I would definitely recommend having something here. As you can see here, I was looking at my handwriting; it's going crazy compared to my other paragraphs. It doesn't matter; just definitely write something down at the end. So, actually, even if you can't finish a paragraph, I would suggest writing the conclusion. So, even if for example, if you have 30 seconds left on the exam, and you're midway through a paragraph but you can't finish it, just jump straight to the conclusion. That is my tip for you guys. It's going to be worth more in the long run. And let me read it out to you then. So to conclude, the view is impartial and only valid when looking on a short-term scale. Sea level rising is only an immediate threat to coastal flooding, whereas climate change and removal of mangroves play a much more global and long-term scale in flood risks. So I've suggested step one. I've done step one. I've simple line linking to the question, agreeing with the view or disagreeing. In this case, I called it impartial, which is basically disagreeing with it and saying, oh yeah, it's partly true. And number two, reiterate your points. I talked about why it's only valid on a short-term scale. And I've just, again, reiterated the points I've made in my main body paragraphs. And then step three, I've briefly compared the factors to say which scale they operate at. So here I've talked about coastal flooding immediate threat, which is a short term, which suggests it's short term. I should have made it more explicit that it's a short term threat. And then I've talked about how removal of mangroves, and what's the other one? Climate change are much more global and long term. So this is what I mean by comparisons being needed and saying which one comes out on top. So yeah, that is it. So the feedback to push me to 20 marks, I would say, is I thought my essay was decent. To push it even more, I could have assessed the scale of the social, economic, and environmental impacts brought by each factor. But that will make the essay a lot longer. But again, that is just something. This is like nitpicking at this point. And I do believe the conclusion was a bit rushed. I could have expanded on it a bit more. So here, as you can see, I've just literally stated it's more long term. I could have given a little explanation. I could have said something like, climate change actually drives sea levels to rise. But I was definitely running out of time in this video and this essay, so I chose not to talk about it in too much detail. And yeah, that was my big feedback with that. And to just reiterate my points here, this is essentially what you need to know for how to write a 20 markers. So the main difference between 12 and 20 markers is that 20 markers require that comparison of factors throughout the essay, whilst 12 markers really just pile at the end. So if you watch my 12 marker videos, I've literally just told you to write about the significance of your factor you're writing about. So for example, for a 12 marker, all you have to do at the end is saying, this is a very significant factor because it's long term. But for 20 markers, I want you to compare. Be like, oh, it's significant, but when compared to climate change or another factor, this is less significant. That's what you need to be doing to evaluate. Another big thing, intro conclusion must be in much more detail for 20 markers. And here's what I mentioned before. After assessing, you need to make a comparison between your points and weigh the significance of each of them relatively. And you need to question your points. Question whether your point is valid. So I've talked about how, if you look at my first paragraph, I talked about this line. However, this argument is far too shallow, as it can be argued that another factor is actually driving these short-term floods. So definitely question whether your you need to question whether your point is actually correct or if it's valid. And that is basically the end of it. So thanks for watching. Good luck on the upcoming A-level exams. It's like, damn, it's late April now, so definitely coming up. I know it can get very long. Make sure you stay hydrated. Follow me on Instagram and my new TikTok I've created. And just to reiterate what I've done at the start, email me if you're interested in the masterclass near the end of April. And I'll see you in the next one.